In this new episode, I speak to philosopher Martin Bunzl about his new book, Thinking While Walking, Reflections on the Pacific Crest Trail. As Martin traverses the 2,650-mile trail from the Mexican-US border to the US-Canada border, questions emerge around our own relationship with what we call the natural world. If man has curated the landscape for thousands of years, both for profit and pleasure, what are the impasses and delusions that we are to face in solving the huge ecological and climate problems that currently block our road to the future? These ideas have been discussed before in terms of man versus nature, but Martin gives concrete examples of where our romantic view of nature has already shaped the world around us. Thinking While Walking is a fascinating book that considers many of the entrenched positions that many of us hold when we think or speak about action on climate change. Thank you for listening to Shaping the Future. There are many more episodes on the way, so please consider subscribing via our podcast or YouTube channels. You can also support my work by backing it on Patreon. So Martin, thank you very much for speaking to me today. Very interested to talk about your new book. But
thanks for inviting me.
Before we talk about the main themes in the book, can you talk a little bit about the role of philosophy in understanding and in some ways unpicking the complexities around climate change?
Sure. You know, if I have a credo that guides me in philosophy in general, it's a famous section of a passage by Bertrand Russell in which he talks about the role of philosophy as what he says is substituting articulate hesitation for inarticulate certainty. And I think a lot of public discourse about important issues, including climate, is oversimplified, in which people take positions that they are incredibly sure about, so sure that they don't think they merit discussion or examination. And I see the role of philosophy as trying to show that there are assumptions that they're making that are unexamined and not clearly justified. And I think a lot of the debate about climate has to do with binaries, the binary between the natural and the human-made or the man-made, the binary between the industrial and nature, the binary between the scientifically made and the naturally found. And I'm dubious that these are very clear kinds of distinctions. So that's one role that I think philosophy has. Another role that's a more technical role that I've worked in is thinking about risk. We're very good at thinking about risk for the mundane and the prevalent in our daily lives, but we're very bad at thinking about risk for large one-off events. And there's a lot of work to be done in that regard. And climate is a quintessential one-off kind of event, an event that has potentially catastrophic consequences with very unclear probabilities associated with them. And the third area that I think philosophy has a lot to say, obviously, is about ethics. And in the case of climate, there's a lot to say about ethics with regard to not only the obligations of the first world or the developed world relative to the developing world, but also how we understand the question of obligation of the developing world, the obligation of all citizens who live today in the world relative to future generations, obligations relative to other species, if that's a coherent notion. And although it's not exclusively a philosophical matter, I'm fixated on the notion that much of the debate about climate takes place within the frame of a first world or developed world standpoint, which makes all kinds of implicit assumptions about the way we live, the wealth with which we live, that has no echo in the lives of people in the rest of the world.
And that is actually something that you tackle in the book in terms of the trade-offs. They're almost like impasses. They're like a series of impasses where you can rapidly bring down atmospheric greenhouse gases by pausing everything, but then by stemming economic development, which lifts people out of poverty, these kinds of things are incompatible quite often, and that takes us away from the equity and justice issues.
Well, not only the equity and justice issues, I recently co-published a piece with a number of climatologists and population experts in which we began an examination of the relationship between family size and household income. And if you look at areas of the world, particularly in Africa, where household income and particularly income controlled by women is very, very low, we see very high population reproductive rates in the family. And while reproductive rates are falling throughout the world in wealthier or developingly wealthy areas, in the rest of the world, it continues to run apace. In fact, at current rates of reproduction, the United Nations projects that population by the end of the century may not be just 10 billion, but there's 15 billion. And so I do think there is a tension between the idea of stemming energy output, which would be associated with stemming economic growth, and the expansion of population. And I don't think this is an easy problem to solve, given that the transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy is going to take much, much longer than lay people who talk about solving the climate crisis think. I mean, I'm reminded that Al Gore in 2008 gave a speech in Philadelphia in which he said, if we just try, we can completely change the economy to renewable energy in 8 years. Well, that's absurd.
And it all comes back to unpicking this complexity and realizing that it's not this switch flipping activity. Another thing I really want to discuss, because this is a major theme in the book, and it's set against what we might consider the natural wonder of the Pacific Crest Trail, and it's our relationship with and our understanding of nature. This has come up in previous interviews, especially when discussing geoengineering of all things. But on the one hand, someone may object to geoengineering in favor of a nature-based solution, while on the other hand, interventions by man to save a species of animal, for example, might be considered very acceptable. Can you give us an overview of the trouble many of us have in identifying as being part of or exclusive from nature?
Yes. Well, I think we have a very romantic conception of our relationship to nature. We forget that human beings began changing nature at least 10,000 years before the Christian era, when we started engaging in settled agriculture. You know, I'm struck by the fact despite my accent, I grew up in London and spent most of my summers in the Lake District. And still today, the geographical tableau of places like the Lake District, for example, if you drive south of San Francisco towards Santa Cruz, you see those wonderful low hills or small mountains that are bare. They just have grass on them. We forget, of course, that look is very much the product of intensive logging and grazing by farmers. When the Lake District was curated in the 18th century to make it the first tourist attraction in England for the newly minted middle class resulting from the Industrial Revolution, the curation continued through the 19th century, in which that look was maintained to stop it going back to nature. So we live with a very romantic notion of nature that has human beings standing aside from nature. That nature without human beings is pure, benevolent, and we come in and destroy nature. And we have destroyed nature. You know, there's a wonderful book about North America before the white man comes that talks about how the native people of North America ran large mammals to extinction and used fire to clear the land all through the East Coast and a section of the West Coast. If we look at the history of discourse about our relationship to nature, actually until the late 18th and early 19th century, nature was viewed as hostile and dangerous to man. Housing, for example, was seen as a safe space against the threat of nature. And it isn't until the 19th century, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, that changes, particularly in Britain, where housing is developed to actually replicate nature with a benevolent idea of nature. Victorian notions of furnishing in British houses brought the idea of nature into the house with large windows. And so we see this change taking place, and it's a change that sets up an opposition between humans, the Industrial Revolution, the pollution of the city, and the purity of nature. We see it in the cultivation of gardens, in the writing of people like Thoreau, and much of it comes down from Humboldt. In fact, I was struck that John Muir, the paragon of protection of nature, who organized the defense of Yosemite National Park, called for the eviction of the native people living in Yosemite because he wanted to promulgate an idea of nature as pure, and nature as pure meant that there should be no relationship to man.
So he's
And
curating.
Yes. So it's a curated notion of nature, just as the Lake District is curated. In fact, I was shocked to see, reading about the Lake District, that when the Lake District was developed, viewing stands were built out of stone. So people could walk down paths and go to large viewing stands to view Lake Windermere, and they still exist today.
Sure. And what I think is really interesting is because when we're trying to make decisions about the future and what we should do, and these interventions, and geoengineering is one name, but people are renaming it as all kinds of different things now. There's different areas within it. And the nature-based solutions, do you think that that is a valid term, or is it very much wrapped up in this romanticism?
I think it's a great question. One consequence of the picture I just painted is that we are saddled with certain binaries. And one of the binaries is the binaries between the natural and the quote man-made, and between the natural and science, and between the natural and technology. If you begin with the idea that we can solve the problem of climate change if we just consume less and consume less energy, and you embrace the idea that it's only a matter of laziness or the focus of the energy company, fossil fuel companies, that prevents us from doing it, then the idea that nature could do it for us is perhaps plausible. But if we look at our actual energy consumption today, and most importantly, the prospective energy consumption of most of the world, that is people in the so-called developing world, there's no way that we can stop using fossil fuel overnight, because it will take us too long to build up renewable energy. Now, if you think that that means, and I believe this to be true, that we have to develop a method of extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, because remember, 20% of the carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere is going to stay there for thousands of years. Then we have to ask, how are we going to do it? And the quote natural way that strikes people to do it is to simply plant more trees. That's a singularly bad idea. Number one, it would take an enormous number of trees, which would exclude agricultural land, in order to build up the capacity to do that. It's dubious whether it would do enough. Trees drop their leaves, at least if they're annual trees, and those leaves decay and release the carbon dioxide they're removed, and the trunks eventually fall down and decay. So I don't think that's going to work. And parenthetically, let me say, we need to remove 8 billion tons of CO2 for every part per million of carbon dioxide that we want to remove in the atmosphere. 8 billion. So the question is, can we do it by other methodology? And there is a lot of research and experiments going on around the world today to see if that's possible. And much of it, nearly all of it, is unnatural. The question is, does that matter? If you hold fast to an ideology that the natural is good and the man-made is bad, it's going to matter to you a lot. But part of my challenge that I take on as a philosopher is to ask, what's that difference? And I think the difference is harder to justify than people think at first. I think the more important issue to ask about man-made or non-natural interventions is whether there is risk involved. And we can talk about the question of risk. And I think we have to distinguish between long-term and short-term interventions in that regard.
Yeah, just coming back to what you said about the scale of this challenge. I mean, 8 billion ton. I mean, it's such an enormous amount.
Well, it is. I mean, just for, the British papers announced proudly that there is going to be a carbon dioxide air removal project started in Scotland that is going to remove 1 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, which is great, but it's a long way from 8 billion tons. And we are talking, unless there is a revolution in the approach, we are talking about something that would consume a gigantic proportion of global GDP in order to correct what we've done.
Yeah. Okay, I want to come back to this this intervention subject, because it's very linked, I think, to the whole nature and human sort of aspect. But we often hear people saying, and I believe I have been one of them, that we need to apply a precautionary principle when it comes to our responses to tackling climate change. And the words that are involved in that are scale, risk, attribution, and responsibility, especially if millions or billions, perhaps, people are at risk of suffering. And does the precautionary principle as a term oversimplify the reality of the climate predicament, or is it an apt term given that there are so many vulnerable people? I mean,
well, I think the precautionary principle is a complicated idea if we look at its history, and I think it makes some dubious assumptions if it's promoted in the way that's usually promoted. The way it's usually promoted is that we should not engage in new or innovative interventions, be they in medicine or in day-to-day matters or in climate, unless we have ruled out any risk of damage. So instead of the conventional cost-benefit analysis in which we say, what's the risk and what's the benefit, and are we willing to assume the risk? The precautionary principle in its strongest form says we shouldn't make any change in our practices if there's any risk involved. That seems to me a hard to define, hard to defend principle, because our daily practice, our status quo practice, has risk associated with it, and nonetheless we engage in it. I think the more important way to think about the precautionary principle is worrying about unknown risk. I mean, there is a reasonable argument, we go back to one of our most famous philosophers, David Hume, that experience gives us information over the new. And to the extent that experience creates an expectation of the future, we have nothing we can do but to rely on it. I'm not a Humean. I believe we learn something firmer than Hume believed from experience. I think daily practice gives us grounds to assess risk, and new practices always run the risk that there is unknown risk associated with it. In my writing, however, I've made a distinction between what I call modular and non-modular interventions. A modular intervention is a new practice that you can organize controlled studies about in a very limited environment in order to examine the potential for risk. You can do it in a laboratory, you can do it in an isolated area, and then you can gradually ramp it up as you learn about the risk. The problem with climate intervention is that it does not lend itself to that. If you look at, I think, the most controversial proposed climate intervention, solar radiation management, in which we put particulate matter into the stratosphere to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, it's impossible, as far as I can see, to do that in a controlled way. You can't curtain off part of the atmosphere and say, let's do it here and see what happens. So it's an all or none kind of intervention. You know, genetic engineering, by contrast, is something that you can do in a very limited area. You can do it in an isolated area. And I think people analyze the risk associated with genetic engineering for that reason. But solar radiation management is very different from that.
Yeah.
In that regard, let me just say that the more important long-term solution of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere does not fall prey to this problem of non-modularity. You can do that step by step and a small way, assess if there are any risks, particularly the risk of storing carbon dioxide. And then as you learn about it, you can begin to ramp it up.
You give the example of ocean liming as an intervention that could work at scale to draw down atmospheric concentrations of CO2, which is the holy grail to someone like me who's constantly worrying about the scale. But at the same time, it's highly risky and could seriously disrupt ocean life, potentially wipe out a species. This is a perfect impasse and one that would doubtless divide public opinion. If the ocean were targeted to absorb billions of tons of carbon, we could easily anticipate donations flowing into organizations like Sea Shepherd who might protest those actions. And you get this sort of antagonism. How can we think around such impasses, or can we think around such impasses? Are there any sort of potentially unifying outcomes?
Well, I like the way you posed the question, because one of the problems with debates about climate change is that a lot of people come to the debate with a framing assumption that there is a no-cost solution. And I don't think there is a no-cost solution. Every potential solution we have has costs. And I think the illusion that there is a no-cost, or delusion that there is a no-cost solution, muddies the water in the debate. You're right that ocean liming does offer one potential solution for a way in which to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There are two ways that it can do it. It can either increase the capacity of oceans to absorb carbon dioxide, or interestingly, it can operate to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that is degassed by the oceans. People are not familiar with the fact that the oceans release large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. So one way to offset anthropogenic carbon dioxide output is to reduce ocean degassing. You do those both by liming. Now, there are two costs of liming that are involved. One is that even though the oceans have acidified and liming operates to reduce the acidity, if you do it quickly to try and quickly reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you place a lot of ocean species under stress because the rapidity of the change is hard for them to adapt to. Natural selection operates on a different time scale than the time scale we want to operate to deal with this problem. So that's one issue. The other issue is that if you're interested in diminishing ocean degassing occurs in particular loci in the oceans where water from deep in the ocean comes up quickly and comes to the surface and the degassing occurs. And you might think, well, let's concentrate liming there rather than throughout the ocean. And then the damage to species throughout the ocean will be somewhat diminished. The problem is that these ocean upwelling areas are nurseries for many different species. And so in liming those areas, you're going to be focusing a stressor on areas of ocean fertility that are nurseries for species. So you might say, well, then we shouldn't do it because we can't endanger these species. I remind your listeners that we are on target to cause the extinction of 80% of the species on Earth as things stand. So it isn't as though we are not already causing extinction of species. We're actually faced with a ghastly choice. Which species should we cause to become extinct? Because I don't think we have a way of avoiding it. Now, a lot of people will say, well, in the case of ocean liming, you're doing this with foreknowledge that you're going to cause this extinction. And that raises an interesting philosophical problem. Does foreknowledge make a difference to your moral responsibility? I don't think it does in this particular situation. The fact that we don't mean to cause extinction to 80% of the species doesn't make it less morally problematic than going in and causing the extinction of one species. I think the more important issue is a biological one. Some species are central to the well-being of many, many other species. If you cause the extinction of that key species, then the knock-on consequences are much, much greater than if you cause the extinction of a species that is lower down in that chain of causation. And that's the way I think we should approach the problem, not as a moral problem of choice, but as a biological problem of doing the least damage.
Yeah, fascinating. And of course, we just don't have many options for scale. And this is the big problem. And that's why an issue like this, which is just sounds awful, that you've got to make this choice. One of the other areas you discuss in the book is engineering, bioengineering. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, this again could be a route to absorbing carbon at scale, but there are people that regard this as evil. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, the project you mentioned utilizes genetic engineering to increase the carbon dioxide uptake of food crops in their root systems. All plants have a molecule called suberin, which is every day when you open a bottle of wine, the cork is made of suberin. And suberin is interesting in that it absorbs carbon dioxide and takes many hundreds of years to decay. In fact, the discovery for this was made by a scientist who noticed that his cork from his wine bottles was not decaying in his compost pile. And he started thinking about that. The project involves increasing the amount of suberin in root systems to double the amount of carbon dioxide roots absorb, and then engineering food crops to incorporate this increased suberin. And the projection is that if 6 major food crops, rice, wheat, corn, were engineered in this way, a substantial portion, up to 40% of the excess carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere every year, beyond what is absorbed by the oceans, could actually be sequestered in these roots, which then stay in the soil and enrich the soil. You really could do that by selective breeding, but it would take an enormous amount of time, and we can't wait to do it. And so I think the feasibility of this project, if it works, and there's a big if there, a lot of work needs to be done, really involves in accepting genetic engineering. And I know that, especially in Europe and especially in Britain and Germany, there are forceful opponents to genetic engineering. Going back to our earlier discussion about the binary between the natural and the man-made, I don't see a distinction between selective breeding, which humans have used for thousands of years to intervene in nature and change the course of the properties of a species, and doing it by genetic engineering is morally different, nor do I think the risk factors are that different, for the following reason. I think genetic engineering is a case in which we can, in fact, examine in a limited environment the potential risks of a particular change being made in the genetic structure of a food crop. And I think that people do respond to that by saying, well, how do you know it won't escape and go wild? We have data on this. We have data on, from now decades of genetic engineering, we have data about contamination of wild strains. We have data about contamination of genetically engineered food crops over other food crops. And we have data about any untoward consequences. And overwhelmingly, the data shows that this is not an arena of significant concern. So I think, again, given the choice between dealing with the climate challenge and the perceived risk of genetic engineering, I'll say it in the strongest terms, even if I were to concede all of the risks to opponents of genetic engineering, and I don't, but if I did for the purposes of argument, I think still they are vastly outweighed by the opportunity to use it to mitigate the consequences of the climate crisis. And I don't think there is a third alternative unless you engage in imaginative science, which I'm an opponent of.
Okay. It's about anticipating risk. And in this case, it is unknown. Whereas the climate risk, I think we know what we're in for. and it's a competing risk in a way.
Well, let me just say with regard to that, I'm not sure we do know with the climate change. I take the projections of climate change with a grain of salt, but I think that's the wrong way to analyze it. I think the potential catastrophe of climate change is so large. It's like going to a doctor and the doctor says to you, you really shouldn't smoke because you may get cancer from it. And you say, well, what's the risk? And he or she says, I don't know. That shouldn't affect you. The fact that there's a non-zero risk should stop you smoking because the consequences of smoking are so great. Same with climate. I don't think we need to know precisely what the probability of the risk is. The fact that there's a possibility of risk is enough for us to take precautions. And I think in the case of genetic engineering, unlike climate, because of its non-modularity, we can in fact determine what the risks are, quantify them, and see if they're worth it.
Okay. Is there a poignance in the passing through the Pacific Crest Trail, whether it's curated by man or part of a raw landscape dating back hundreds of millions of years, that you are still part of it and you're not remote from it? And as such, are we actually fighting to save the planet? Or are we more struggling to redefine or reimagine it as a livable place for whatever emerges?
Well, I think this is a deep question. If I believed in God, the God I would believe in is Darwin. Darwin is my God. And natural selection is an astonishing mechanism by which life on Earth develops and proceeds. And I think much of our relationship to nature is fixed on the idea of ignoring the realities of natural selection. I mean, when I walk on the Pacific Crest Trail and when I'm in marvelous places like Yosemite, I fall prey, like everyone else, to the idea that we have to keep this exactly the way it is and that we are changing it. And if we just don't do anything, it will stay as this magnificent, magnificent space. But of course, that's a delusion. Yosemite was covered with ice during the Ice Age. It was largely created as a consequence of the Ice Age. And whatever we do, Yosemite over thousands of years will change in unpredictable kinds of ways. We can't stop nature. And it's our own conceit that leads us to believe that we can. We dress that conceit up in all kinds of arguments that we're keeping nature pure. But what we're really doing is building a nature that fits our anthropocentric interests. The Lake District appeals to us. And so we want to keep it the way it is. Yosemite appeals to us. And again, John Muir's clearing out the Indians, who after all were as much part of nature as anything else, and the mess that they created to make it clean and organized, was a very deliberate idea to build a picture of nature that would appeal to us. I think that one of the consequences, the legacy of the Industrial Revolution and the binary we created of us versus nature, is that we think of ourselves as outside nature. There's nature and there's us. We are not able to accept the idea that we are part of nature and everything we do is part of nature. I mean, it grates against our sensibilities to think that the plastics that we are disseminating throughout the oceans is somehow not nature. I mean, we're animals, we made it as much as birds make nests. And it's, I think, not until we understand that we are part of nature and that we operate in nature that we can begin to overcome what I think of these unnatural binaries between us and what we do and what nature does. I think we need to understand that it's imperative, not because nature has moral standing, but it's imperative for, if only us, future generations, for us to right what we've done in order to have a habitable planet, not just for us, but for other species. And I think that when you walk the Pacific Crest Trail, even though it is a human-made enterprise, right down to the plastic mile markers every mile along the 2,600 miles, we have to overcome the idea that even though it's curated by us, it's something magnificent. It inspires awe. And as I say in the last chapter of the book, and this was a change for me, instead of worrying about the standard philosophical question, do I have a duty to other animals, to future generations? Do I have a duty to nature? I discovered on the trail that if I stopped thinking so analytically and allowed the magnificence and grandeur of it to wash over me, I was filled with awe. And awe inspires humility. And humility is what we need. We don't need a philosophical argument to arrive at humility. It's enough that we expose ourselves to places that give us a sense of our smallness relative to the world. It evokes in us awe and humility, and that we follow the consequences of that in the way we behave in the world.
Well, thank you, Martin. We need space to contemplate a lot of these thoughts, and nature does provide that space. And then your book is literally called Thinking While Walking. And all of these issues that we've covered and more are in the book. And I hope people take the time to buy it and read it and actually consider a lot of these things, because I think it helps to open up this discussion, which can quite often be quite closed around camps. And I think that's not always helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.